The OnePlus Nord is an affordable yet bougie phone. It's good at certain things, but not so great at other things. My name's Daniel, welcome to Tech Wrap, and let's wrap this tech up. The OnePlus Nord has a 6x44-inch OLED display, making it one of the greatest displays on a cell phone yet. I just lied. That's pretty funny. It's not. But back to serious talk. We've got a 48 megapixel ultra wide camera, an 8 megapixel lens with a 2 megapixel macro camera, and a 5 megapixel depth sensor. Now, if you heard everything I just said, clearly start to understand that this phone has more cameras than the Note 10 Plus and possibly the Galaxy S20. How is that? Well, we'll talk about that later on. Now, when it comes to selfie cameras, we've got a 32 megapixel wide-angled camera, an ultra-wide 8 megapixel camera. So that's pretty reasonable when you're talking about a selfie camera, a simple camera that you'll take selfies on. I do have to mention that the actual cameras are in a hole punch display on the top left. There is a pretty big, not notch, but the cameras do make a pretty large impact on the screen. So that does take some time to get used to, but the Samsung Galaxy S10 had the same problem, and we've got past that. Alright. When we're looking at a processor, we've got a Qualcomm Snapdragon 765. Now, I'm not going to say that it's bad because you're paying 399 euros for this phone, but I feel like they could have done a better job with the processing power of the cell phone. But we can talk about that later. The memory configurations, the phone comes in an 8GB version and a 12GB version. When we're talking about RAM, that is pretty comparable to the Note 10 or Note 10 Plus. So that's pretty standard these days. When we're talking about storage, we've got a 128GB version and a 256GB version. So when it comes to storage, that's also pretty reasonable. No debate about that. So there are fingerprint sensors on the phone. Well, the only fingerprint sensor, and OnePlus is pretty much known for having the fastest or even the best fingerprint sensors there are. So there's no complaining about that. And of course, we've got OnePlus's famous warp charging, which is pretty great. Charge your phone in 30 minutes. Wow. So the phone is running Oxygen OS. Like most OnePlus phones, it's pretty reasonable to say that Oxygen OS is pretty based for OnePlus. And we've also got a 4,000, if I'm not mistaken, a 4,000 milliamp hour battery. And that's a pretty reasonable battery, of course, like we've said. Now, this video isn't just describing the specs of the phone. It actually is we're actually wondering if this phone is worth purchasing. At 399 euros, you're looking at pretty much a bargain, or steal in this case. But we're going to have to go to one thing that we have talked about before, the cameras. There are 5 cameras on this phone, or not counting the depth camera, 4 cameras on this phone. That is a lot of cameras, and we can't really say that that's a great thing because you have a large amount of cameras at a cost. Now, I feel like OnePlus could have used that money to, let's say, place a headphone jack on it, because, ladies and gentlemen, OnePlus has finally gotten rid of the headphone jack. Those damn bastards. Alright, moving on. The processor. It's an alright processor, but I feel like they could have done more with processing power. In addition to that, you've got 5 cameras and a pretty crappy processor. Well, that is something to rant about. So, and in theory, the display is a pretty great display if we look at price, but yet the processor holds back on the display. So, high processing things like gaming, or even working off of the phone in graphic design software or Photoshop software, that wouldn't be legible. Now, we are looking at a pretty cheap price, but still, you're compromising on so much. So now, what's good about this phone? It's got a 90 Hz display. Without a doubt, for 400 euros. That's a pretty great bargain. And it's got a pretty large battery for the phone itself. Now, when we look at cheaper phones, they always compromise on things like battery or processing power. In this case, it's just processing power, but it's got a pretty reasonable battery for a great price. Now, here's the greater question. Can this phone compare to the iPhone SE? I tell you now, I feel like this phone can't, because even though the iPhone SE is valued at $400, it's got a greater processor, but it has flagship specs. The iPhone SE increasingly has flagship specs and is without a doubt a pretty great phone for the price. When we look at the OnePlus Nord, we're looking at only one color for the phone. That's one. Then we're looking at not such a great processor. That's two. Then we're looking at 5 cameras that you might not even need, that aren't even great. That's 3. Then you're looking at, well, other things like one single speaker, and we're also looking at no headphone jack. So is this phone worth it? No, it's not. So this brings me to my conclusion. Ladies and gentlemen, I do say now, like MKBHD said, and like Linus Tech Tips has speculated, this phone isn't the best for its price. Do I not mention that this phone you can't purchase in America? So it's worthless for us here in America, us rich folk. That is a joke. But do I say this phone, pretty reasonable for its price, yet not the greatest. Who is this phone made for? Well, I'd say enthusiasts who want to have the Android experience but don't have the money for it. It's definitely not a phone that I'd pick. Ladies and gentlemen, please subscribe to this channel if you want to see more videos like this. Please leave a like if you felt like this video deserves a like. And please comment down below on what kind of content you'd like to see on this channel. Let's wrap this up.